Well, he's back, which means I did not mess up the first time around, which is good. Although, I've attempted sending Chris a T-shirt and it got stolen by the Canadian customs. It's not by the American, definitely not by the American customs. So I'm sending him another one later this week. And I'm gonna put like on the envelope a label, hands off, please. Chris, welcome back to Healthcare Unfiltered. In the rare circumstance that somebody did not listen to the first episode, which would be a disaster, by the way, if they haven't, maybe a little bit about you and an introduction, because the topic today is going to be really exciting.
Thanks, Chadi. Thank you very much for having me back on the show. And a bit of background, I think the way we should tell this story about the missing T-shirt is that Healthcare Unfiltered is such a hot commodity right now north of the border in Canada. Like these T-shirts are highly, highly desired. So you should not have gone on the air or told all your friends you're mailing a T-shirt to booth in Canada, because there's a lot of Canadians that want those shirts. So I think we'll need to notify the Mounties, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, to keep an eye out to make sure I get my T-shirt, and I'll wear it with pride. But in any case, thanks for having me back. So I'm a medical oncologist, professor of oncology at Queen's University in Kingston, Canada. I split my time between the Cancer Center, where I look after patients with GI cancer, and I run a health services research program in the other part of my time, where I'm interested in issues of access to care, quality of care outcomes, working with real world data. As we talked about last time, I also have a major interest in the value of cancer care, magnitude of benefit, and have done work in that space at the global policy level with the World Health Organization and close friends and colleagues in India and beyond. So I look forward to our discussion today. Thanks for having me back.
I have to tell you, I'm honestly, truly fascinated how much you do, but just beyond just simply taking care of patients. It's really a lot of work, so kudos to you, which means you're good in time management. But today we're going to focus on two topics. One is the general topic of conflict of interest. So we have to define it and what it means, because it's too much on social media with this. And I'm going to, by the way, I'm not going to let you go today without talking why you're not on Twitter. And the second thing is, research with pharma. Sometimes there's a lot of backlash that I see about, how do you work with pharma and do research with them and all of these things. So two could be contentious topics, at least they are contentious on social media. So you're doing good by staying away for now. Tell me about conflict of interest. What is there a definition? I mean, what is conflict of interest in biomedicine?
Okay, well, you opened with a tough question, Chadi. So, I mean, the way I conceptualize this is, as physicians and oncologists, our primary duty is to look after patients. And these patients are very sick and they're often very vulnerable. And we're seeing them at a moment in their life where they really need our undivided attention and help. And so I guess one could conceptualize a conflict of interest would be if there's any other external force that might influence decision-making that would not allow us to fulfill our primary mandate, which is to look after patients. So there can be a number of different conflicts of interest. And I think the one I'm sure that we're going to talk about primarily today is the concept of financial conflict of interest. And this is something that I've had, an interesting personal journey about. I wrote about it with one of my mentors from training in an essay in the British Medical Journal 3 or 4 years ago. And the title of the paper was something along the lines of managing financial conflicts of interest in oncology, tales of the $80 hamburger, or something like that. And it had to do with a hamburger that I had as a resident that was $80. And so I trained, in the early 2000s at the University of Toronto. And it was very common at the major medical centers at that time, I think throughout North America, to have a lot of engagement with the pharmaceutical industry. We had noon rounds several days a week, again, with excellent teaching, usually by the chief medical resident, about approach to diabetic ketoacidosis or lung cancer or whatever, blackboard sessions that were really excellent. And there was always free sandwiches there, and they were delicious sandwiches. And I was a junior resident, enjoyed them. I didn't really do the math to think about who was paying for those sandwiches. And then later on, as I began training in oncology, there became more opportunities to go to these meetings and these conferences, and I was getting given very expensive textbooks, and we would have journal clubs once a month. And these journal clubs where, the residents and the faculty would choose the paper, and it would be dissected with critical appraisal and a discussion. But these events were held at like the nicest restaurants in Toronto, that as a lowly resident we never would have gone to. And so this blew our minds. We went there, and there was actually an $80 hamburger on the menu. And so
$80.
$80 hamburger, Chatty. I mean, I don't know if this is like only a high-end Canadian thing, but I suspect you could find an $80 burger in your neighborhood as well if you look hard enough. Maybe we'll have to go find one together one day. But I'll make you pay for it. It'll be the podcast that'll pay for it. I'll wear your T-shirt. It'd be good advertising. But in any case, so I kind of lived maybe somewhat naively through that era. And I guess that the time when I started to feel a little uncomfortable was at a cancer center, a big cancer center in Toronto. I was seeing patients, and a pharmaceutical rep showed up that I'd known, I'd seen at some other events, and kind of like pulled me into a patient room and gave me this little spiel, and then handed me DaVita's textbook. And it felt a little weird. And then I walked in, I was seeing patients. It felt uncomfortable. And I think that was maybe the beginning of me starting to think. I was, probably a fourth year resident or fifth year resident at this point. So I started to think that, there's something that just doesn't feel right about this. In any case, as I was finishing my clinical training and transitioning to research fellow and then junior faculty, I had a series of discussions with one of my mentors, an internal medicine physician, a very senior internist in Toronto named Alan Detsky. And Alan actually sat me down, and basically the gist of the conversation was, I think I told him about some of these uncomfortable feelings I had. And what he said to me, Chatty, was, Chris, conflict of interest in medicine is a major problem. It's not really well recognized yet. Almost everyone in this specialty is conflicted and plays this game. He said, as you're about to launch your career, consider making yourself one of the rare people that have no relationships with the pharmaceutical industry, because one day the world will change. And the people who get to lead trials, write guidelines, write editorials will be those physicians that have no financial relationships with pharma. And he said, think about positioning yourself to be one of those people. He said, it'll be a very unorthodox career, but it's probably for you, it might be the right thing to do. So it's a really interesting series of conversations. And Alan, was an internist, in the 80s and 90s who gave all sorts of lectures all over the world and got paid very well by pharma to do that, and thought that didn't really think much of conflict of interest until I think he published one of the original seminal papers. The first author was Stell Fox, who was a trainee in Toronto at the time, in the New England Journal of Medicine in 1999, showing that the very controversial story of calcium channel blockers, where there was no really good data one way or the other to support their use. And they very clearly showed that editorials and commentaries written by physicians who had financial relationships with companies who make calcium channel blockers were much more likely to tell the story in a favorable light compared to physicians without those relationships. And that completely changed Alan's approach. And so in the 2000s, he transitioned to be a very strong advocate to identify these potential conflicts and mitigate or minimize them or reduce them if at all possible. So this was the beginning of a journey. And I was lucky. Like, I'm not a clinical trialist. I'm a health services researcher, so I can function in an academic environment without the need to have rich relationships or interactions with the pharmaceutical company. So I basically had zero relationships throughout my entire career, like really zero. When we wrote this essay, we were very careful. We didn't want to make this a personal thing, criticize anyone's integrity. This is just kind of a philosophy that I have when it comes to the way that I've launched my career. And I guess it's important to distinguish, engaging with industry is obviously hugely important to advance clinical trials. And there's no way that we would be where we are if there weren't productive and bi-directional relationships between academic oncologists and the pharmaceutical industry to identify new targets, new drugs, and launch clinical trials. So I'm not proposing a world in which there are not relationships. I think, the research realm is one thing. There's the whole issue about personal payments, and we'll talk about that later because we've published on it recently. But I guess kind of the concern I have is that rather than being an important player in the system, the pharmaceutical industry, I think, now controls the system. They, by virtue of finances, they control most of the research agenda in oncology, and that has problems, I think.
Very excellent points. Appreciate you sharing the perspective. Let me go back a little bit to your prior experiences just in the early days. Did you ever, well, I'll back up a little bit. Clearly, conflict of interest, to your earlier definition, is when you really make a decision that is conflicted with patient care because of a financial relationship or another relationship. And I'm going to talk about a couple of aspects of that. At any point during that time where you were doing the journal club, going to these restaurants and the $80 burger, did you ever feel that you would prescribe something to a patient you were caring for that you did not think was appropriate because you had that burger?
No, it's a great question. And the answer is no. So at two levels, Chadi. The first level is because, the sandwiches at Rounds, we're talking about hyponatremia and the approach to heart failure and things like that. So there was no proprietary, compound even in discussion. The journal club discussions, we chose the articles, and the rep that was paying for dinner, I don't even think was related to the article. So again, I was so ignorant at that time. I don't even know what company the rep represented. Getting the DaVita textbook, I don't know. I can't imagine how that would have influenced my decision making. And certainly the $80 burger, landed a nice paper in BMJ, and I still like telling that story, but I don't think that changed anything. So there's two answers to your question, Chai. First of all, I think the amount of interaction I had and the type of interaction, it would be difficult to imagine it would have changed in a major way an interaction with a patient. So that's point number one. But point number two is that studies have shown over and over again that these interactions do influence physician behavior. They influence even modest financial gifts have been shown repeatedly to influence prescribing. There's very likely to be strong relationships in how editorials are written, how guidelines are written. So there's literature that shows that these relationships do influence physician behavior. And the other interesting part of that literature, to really answer your question, is that when you ask physicians who have these relationships, does it change your prescribing? Everyone says no, of course it doesn't, but they almost always say, but I think it's a problem for other physicians. And so there's a disconnect there. And so I don't think anyone goes into a patient's room saying, I got $20,000 last year from whatever company, therefore I'm going to use the drug. I think these influences are more subtle than that. And I think the literature supports that. I would also say, Chadi, that these companies, they're smarter than us as simple oncologists. They're not making these massive investments of literally hundreds of millions of dollars of payments per year to physicians. They're not doing this to make friends. They're doing this because there's a return on investment. And so I think it would be overstating it to say that if you go to one drug dinner, you're going to change the way you treat the patient you see tomorrow. But I think it would be naive to assume that there's not some long-term influence of these relationships on how physicians practice.
So how is that? I mean, I think when you talk about conflict of interest, there's obviously several layers of that. Because when you go to conferences, when you go to you've been to the American Society of Clinical Oncology meeting.
Yeah, many times.
Been to the American Society of Hematology meeting. And I think you see that there are really sponsors and exhibit booths that is really filled by the pharmaceutical companies that obviously is giving millions of dollars to the society that you actually belong to and pay membership dues for. So how is it that how is the ASCO not conflicted, getting 10s, 15s, $20 million each meeting? Frankly, and you're the one who's conflicted because you had dinner. Why is there a disconnect, I guess? Why doesn't the society that we pay dues for say, you know what? We don't want to have an exhibit hall anymore because we believe the exhibit hall does influence physicians. It seems like there's a disconnect there.
Chadi, I agree with you. I think it does. I think that I think that this is not just related to ASCO, but I think all medical societies should really reflect on their mission. And this obviously is a financial decision. How can they appropriately and in a principled way engage with the pharmaceutical industry without being unduly influenced? And so I think you've hit the nail on the head. I think it's disingenuous to suggest that oncologists should not be going to these fancy dinners, but our society should accept millions of dollars from the pharmaceutical industry. So, I mean, that might be a controversial position, but I think there's a disconnect there.
But the other thing that is really important to recognize, and I think you alluded to that earlier, as a clinical trialist, if you're a clinical trialist, let's face it, look, it is impossible to do clinical trials without collaborating with pharma. I think, we all know where funding comes from, and, the NIH or you know how the funds flow. And you mentioned that, your current research position at least allows you to be critical of that, but your research career is not dependent on it.
Yeah.
How can you be a clinical trialist without, can you be a clinical trialist without working with pharma?
So, Chai, these are really good points. I think let's distinguish relationships with pharma that really are research driven versus maybe consulting or speaking or advisory boards that are not research related. I think they're very different phenomena. I think that you're right. I mean, there's many extremely successful clinical trialists in our community who have worked for decades with pharma. They've done it in a principled way. They've made major contributions to our field. And I think that it would be naive to say that if you're going to run clinical trials, you would never work with pharma. And I think it needs to be done carefully. And I think that there's lots of opportunities for appropriate relationships in that space. I think so. I do remember when I decided that I was going to be a health services researcher, not a clinical trialist. One of my other mentors, who happened to be a health services researcher, really sat me down and said, "Chris, are you sure you want to do this? Because it means you're going to have to be writing grants to CIHR, which is the Canadian version of NIH." And in his words, he said, "It would be a lot easier career to brand yourself as a trialist and run phase 2 trials for pharma." And I'm not trying to denigrate the effort and the work involved in running clinical trials. There's a lot of complexities there, so that's an oversimplification. But it's, I think, a bit of an easier career path in some ways to get started on. I think there's a lot more resources there. There's a lot of good work that can be done. There's a whole bunch of trials, though, that are probably pretty silly that are being run that just pad people's CVs and develop careers and perhaps provide financial benefits for hospitals and for companies. So I think the pendulum has swung too far. I think that, really creative clinical trialists, I think the ideal position would be a trialist who engages with industry to run high impact clinical trials that will change patient care, but also has a portfolio of trials that answers other questions that matter to patients but do not matter to pharma. So if I think in my career, I've been practicing as a GI medical oncologist now for almost 15 years, probably the two, greatest innovations in GI oncology from a clinical trials point of view that directly impacted my patients in a huge way were trials. First of all, the IDEA collaborative, right? De-escalating care from 6 months to 3 months and reducing the neuropathy. That has transformed the lives of many, many, many of my patients. Much more so than some of the very marginal gains that we deliver with other new treatments. And the other big one was allowing patients to avoid a lifetime of injections of low molecular weight heparin, like, shifting to the oral agents. And for oncology, cancer-related VT was also huge. So, but there's a huge number of clinical trials that can and should be done that don't require pharma funding. But the reality is our system is not set up to invest in these trials. And that's a problem with the system, right? We don't need to, we shouldn't put up with that. How is it possible that we have a society that's willing to spend tens of millions and hundreds of millions of dollars on new cancer medicines, some of which provide large benefit, but many of which arguably add perhaps a few extra weeks of life or months of life at best? We have a system that puts that much resources into cancer medicines, but it won't invest a fraction of those resources into non-pharmaceutical company clinical trials to understand how can we de-escalate care, how can we give care closer to home, how can we improve communication skills. There's so many other amazing questions that could be addressed by clinical trials, but the system is currently not set up with resources to allow that. So what happens? We're all, the system's addicted to money from the pharmaceutical industry.
Well, but I mean, I mean, let's take choose a disease out there, whichever disease, GI oncology. Let's choose colorectal cancer. If you look at the natural progression of treating metastatic colorectal cancer, when I started practice way before you did, and yeah, I mean, I could tell you, when I was doing my training, the questions in GI oncology were, how do you give 5-FU? Roswell Park or Mayo regimen or all that stuff. I mean, if I look at where colorectal cancer now, metastatic colorectal cancer now, it's hard for me to believe that we could have been here today just based on academic research. I can't buy it. Bevacizumab, I mean, we could name, cetuximab, even understanding a lot of these things. It's collaboration. We needed the brains of the academic physicians that really are working, and we need to be able to convince pharma to spend resources and time and money into these things. So it's hard for me to believe that today patients would have been where they are if we did not work with pharma.
Chadi, I agree with you and I disagree with you. So this is why this conversation is fun. I completely agree with you. So I'm not suggesting that we stop doing trials with pharma. We need them. We need them. But I would argue that our patients today would be doing even better if the pendulum was more in the middle. And so we invested in trials with pharma, and resources went there, and patients and investigators' energy went there, but we didn't overshoot it. And so we also put time, energy, and effort and resources into other things, like how many additional RCTs do we need of different me-too immunotherapy drugs, or all these countless phase 2 or single-arm trials that we're doing now that, it's a whole nother conversation, but unfortunately, those are now being considered the pinnacle of evidence. And so we're doing a lot of research that's probably wasted resources. It's not really, we don't even know if it's helping patients, and it's duplicative. So I think that I certainly agree with you that they are very important partners, but I think we've overshot the pendulum so far to one extreme. I'm not proposing it goes to the other extreme of no trials with pharma. It needs to be in the middle.
Yeah, and I think that would be probably fair if you would want to be in the middle. The problem is that it's just very difficult to, if you wear on the pharma hat, it's very difficult to invest a lot of money and efforts and resources unless there's something for them to gain.
Totally agree.
Totally agree. They're not there. I mean, again, I would say that pharma companies are accountable against their shareholders if they're publicly traded, and they have to really think through that as well. But yeah, having it in the middle would be great. I just don't think we can.
No, but Chadi, it wouldn't be easy. And I agree. I'm not suggesting that I wouldn't expect the pharmaceutical industry to pay for clinical trials that are not going to improve their revenue stream. But I mean, who are the other major players in this space? Payers, governments, right? And so it boggles my mind that payers in Canada or the US or Europe are willing to spend hundreds of millions of dollars on therapies, but because we're so siloed in our system, there's a research division and there's a health system delivery program, but you take a fraction of that and reinvest it into clinical trial infrastructure to ask important questions like, can we de-escalate care? Do we need to give immunotherapy forever? Can we give shorter treatment intervals? Ultimately, these questions will actually benefit patients. They're also probably going to save money for the health system. So I think that I agree with you. Pharmaceutical industry is just filling a void that's been created because other entities are not providing adequate funds. And that's why we end up with a lot of, silly clinical trials and duplicative research, because as junior investigators, you're right, it's way easier to get funded to run a phase 2 trial or a Me-Too phase 3 trial than it is to get an operating grant from the NIH or, the MRC or CIHR in Canada. And so if those resources existed, we would have the next generation of talented, young, creative oncologists perhaps more interested in running those trials. And then pharma would have to focus their efforts on, what is the really top priorities. Right now, they can do trials in anything because the investigators are there, the patients are there. But if the investigators in trials had other resources to answer other questions, then the pharmaceutical landscape would perhaps become more efficient as well.
How much of this, Chris, is academic culture, where you really are rewarded if you have several studies, even phase 1 or phase 2, in terms of promotion, in terms of prestige, in terms of being able, getting a couple of phase 2s out there in JCO that have never advanced the field have made careers for many people. Not every trial is going to be transformative. And there are many professors out there who have never done anything to change the standard of care. But in order for you to do that, you got to publish, you got to get trials, you got to get something out there. How much of this you feel that the academic culture needs reform?
Yeah, I agree with you, Chadi. I think that's why we end up with all these phase 2 single-arm trials people say, oh, there's not enough patients to run an RCT. Well, there actually is, but you're right. The incentives right now are much more enticing for someone to run their own phase 2 trial at 1 or 2 centers and get a first author paper in GEM Oncology or JCO, rather than contributing and being a middle author on a practice-changing RCT. And I think this is a conversation that we need to have as a community. And you're right, the incentives right there do not support the vision that you and I are talking about.
And I wish I see a little bit more discussion about that, because it is really it's really a double-sided thing. And I think that the culture in academic medicine, publish or perish, as we say, it's really alive and well. And part of this, and I'd like you to reflect on that, even from a conflict of interest perspective, if I'm an investigator and I have my own phase 2 study, primary endpoint is response rate. I mean, that's really all, and in a particular disease, and I'm trying to consent a patient for that trial. Rest assured that the way I would consent a patient is probably going to be a little bit more leaning towards enrolling that patient in the trial. It is unlikely going to say, well, I don't know if this drug works. I don't know if this drug is going to have a high response or whatever it is, because if I enroll, I'm going to get the funds, I'm going to get the paper, I'm going to get all of these things. I mean, I call this either financial or non-financial conflict of interest, and I don't see that even rarely discussed, to be honest.
Oh, I agree. And I mean, I think this isn't the case in Canadian centers as far as I'm aware of, but I've heard colleagues say that, there's centers in the US clearly enrolling patients and opening trials brings in money to the institution. My understanding is that there's some places where it also impacts the physician's income for every patient that they enroll.
Absolutely.
So that's a clear, I mean, there's big alarm bells there, right? I mean, I think that patients knew that, or there was a discussion, there's big alarm bells about that. So I think these conflicts are real. I think that, the research payments, we are amongst the most privileged profession in the world, right? We get paid a lot of money, and we have an incredible privilege, not just the financial rewards of our job, but the privilege of looking after patients and having work that is so meaningful and fulfilling. And if someone's being paid a full-time salary to be an academic oncologist, I'm not so sure why they would necessarily warrant, or what the incentives, how they should be set up, that they get extra money for basically doing their job. One of my mentors when it comes to clinical trials are Ian Tannick and Elizabeth Eisenhower, and they've successfully transformed the care of several different forms of cancer and by leading pivotal trials. But they've always been, really pivotal role models and very principled in the fact that they do research, they do not benefit financially from that, and the non-research payments, they don't, they're not involved in that, or if it comes back to them, it goes to their institution. So I think that's an important distinguish. Is the money for research, or is it being, is it a personal payment? And so this is one of the things we talked about, one of the papers we published recently. So we use the US Open Payments database to look at payments for cancer medicines to US oncologists. And we had to look at US oncologists because, at least in the United States, you publicly report this. We don't do this yet in Canada, and it's a problem in our system. And when our paper was published, I was asked repeatedly by journalists in Canada, well, is this a problem that exists in our own country? And I said, undoubtedly, yes, but the fact that I can't answer that is a problem in itself. And so, we had two papers. The first one published in the Journal of Cancer Policy, reported that about, I think, 85% of US oncologists get payments, non-research payments from the pharmaceutical industry for cancer medicines. The second paper, which was, probably the higher profile one, which came out in the Journal of Oncology Practice just a month or two ago, led by one of our residents, Dr. Kristen Wright, we identified the fact that although payments are very common across oncology, the average payment is modest per year in the range of $100 or $200 per year. But in a small proportion of oncologists, 1% of oncologists are getting paid more than $100,000 per year. And that's a lot of money. And I don't know where along that continuum someone's decision-making is influenced. If you're getting 5 cents a year from pharma or $10 or $100, is that really going to change things? I don't know. But at some point that flips, and I suspect well before you get to $100,000, there's going to be clearly subconscious decision-making that will be influenced. And so, the piece that was published in JOP with a real, I think, a very, very well written and firm, strongly worded editorial by Mark Ratain was about this being a real problem in our field, getting, and because the paper that we described, these doctors, we call them the high flyers. The journal made us change that name. The high flyers getting $150,000, $200,000, $300,000 a year from pharma. When we did detective work, they're leaders in our field. They are writing guidelines, writing editorials, and they're leaders.
I think that this is obviously a lot of money. Nobody can argue with that clearly. But let me give you a provocative thought to reflect on, because I really think about that a lot. And so this is, let's do a theoretical experiment, a thought experiment, as they call it. So you as a GI oncologist, you believe in a particular drug. Let's say you believe in drug X. It actually works in the disease. You are very convinced it helps your patients. It does actually, has shown clinical trials, pick your drug. But you really believe in the drug. You believe it, you've tried it, you like it, it does help your patients, you believe in the trials that led to its approval, and you're a proponent of that drug. If I am consulting you and I call you, hey, Chris, what do you think of this drug? You would tell me, this is a good drug to use in this indication and you should use it. And there's a drug B that you really don't like. You either view it as too toxic, you either view it as too problematic, you probably think that trials that led to its approval are rather questionable. So if I call Chris and say, what do you think of drug B? You'll say, it's approved, but I really don't buy into it. I think it's a little bit too toxic and too problematic. It is very logical that you are willing to speak for drug A as opposed to drug B. Not because, again, you do believe in the drug, you like the drug, you've used it, you believe in its benefit. And sure, you're going to make a lot of money by speaking it, but you're not really speaking about a drug that you don't actually believe in. You actually are not kind of selling your soul and you're going and speaking for drug B, despite the fact you don't believe in it. You're willing to really forget that and go and talk about it. The reason I say that is I think most physicians, and again, I may be wrong, when they, again, I'm agreeing with you, it's a lot of money, but they are not necessarily speaking on behalf or promoting drugs that they don't believe in their clinical benefit. So, I think that's where I struggle with that, because if I'm getting paid to talk about a drug that I totally think it's a dog drug, and I'm still talking about it, then I'm obviously clearly doing this for the money. The other, if I'm talking to a drug I believe in, yes, I'm making money, but I actually believe in the clinical value of the drug and I'm willing to promote it and I'm willing to go and tell people about it and I would like them to actually use it because it does help patients. So how do you really differentiate that? How do you actually differentiate? Of course, if I'm a thought leader in acute myeloid leukemia, the acute myeloid leukemia companies are going to ask me to speak, and I'm going to probably speak to a drug or two that I really believe in their clinical utility and value. Are you proposing that physicians are talking on behalf of drugs that they don't actually even believe in their benefits so they can make more money?
No, I don't think so. I don't think that, fundamentally people are good. Almost everyone in the world are good people. And so I don't think anyone's going to this with any malintent. I do think that it's more nuanced than that. And I think that you're right. If you're a famous leukemia doctor and there's a great leukemia drug, I think speaking about it in a venue that is not directed and run by the pharmaceutical industry is entirely appropriate. And I don't go to these drug dinners and I don't get asked to speak at them anymore because I think people read my $80 hamburger essay and didn't invite me anymore. But I think it's part of the package. It's not just that drug. It's the slides have been prepared by the company. The clinical trial's been designed by the company. As you know, Chatty, most of the drugs in our field that are talked about at these dinners and these meetings are probably modest in their efficacy. So I think that it's not specifically related to maybe that one drug at that one talk, but it's part of a larger problem, which is a culture problem. And I think that if there's a great treatment, then experts should be talking about, but ideally they'd be talking about at an educational session at a major meeting and not at something that is funded. And I think we all know that the vast majority of the time these slides have been made by another entity. And so I think that's where it becomes problematic.
All of these major meetings are sponsored. Like,
Yeah.
you go to wherever. Pick ASCO GI, ASCO GU, ACR, ASCO, ASH, all of these meetings, they're already sponsored either directly or indirectly. The American Society of Hematology, they have the Friday before the meeting, they call it Super Friday.
Yeah.
I don't know if you know that. It's like literally
No.
It's Super Friday Satellite Symposia. If you Google Friday ASH Satellite Symposia, it is about 20 symposiums all day Friday that are all sponsored by Pharma. And it's really, it's how American Society of Hematology makes money a little bit on top of the, I guess what I'm trying to allude to, Chris, I'm trying to move to solutions.
Yeah.
I buy some of the problems you're saying, and I agree with, not with everything, but I would say with mostly everything you said. I'm struggling in the solutions phase.
Yeah, I agree. So listen, I would say that when there's an arm's length financial relationship and there's a pooling of resources, then it's probably less problematic. So let's imagine there's a famous leukemia doctor who's going to talk about a new leukemia drug. In my mind, even though the ASH educational meeting or ASCO annual meeting, it gets a lot of money from 10 or 20 or 30 different pharma companies, that to me seems less problematic than a dinner at a fancy restaurant that is paid for, funded, scripted, slides made by a single company that make the drug that's being discussed. And so I think there's a continuum there. And you're right, I'm not proposing that we have, I don't have the solutions to this, Chad. It's really, really complicated. And I think, I would want to make it clear that I'm not proposing that we either cut off pharma and do nothing with them, or that I have all the answers, because this is really complicated. But I do think it is naive for us to put our head in the sand and imagine it's not a problem. And I think that, patients probably would be uncomfortable if they knew about some of the relationships that were going on. There's also not another, at the end of the day, we're servants to the public, we're public servants. And if you look at other public officials, some of these behaviors, many of these behaviors would not be tolerated in educational spaces and the political sphere. And so I think our field at least needs to have these discussions and then collectively move towards some kinds of solutions.
Chris, what's your opinion on pharma sponsoring or supporting patient advocacy groups and advocacy societies? Leukemia Research Foundation, I don't know, Cure Cancer, you could process us too. We could pick, goodness, there are so many. And, I think I have used some of these foundations to get sometimes transportation to patients, vouchers, all of these things. What's your opinion there?
Yeah, listen, I agree. This is complicated, especially if they're providing a service. I'm just in the process of writing an essay right now with colleagues who live and practice in sub-Saharan Africa about the conflict of interest in that space. And, these are really complicated issues. And so there are programs and opportunities that are provided by pharmaceutical support in every health system that would not exist if that support were not there. So you've raised a really challenging issue. I think that I just think at some point there's a line that's crossed where these programs are overstepping. I think this is going to get me in trouble. I think a lot of these patient advocacy groups, they have the best of intentions, and obviously they want to improve things for their loved ones and themselves and their community. But I think if they are getting heavily funded by pharma and getting all of their messaging, teaching, promotional materials from the pharmaceutical industry, then they may not have a clear picture or as clear a picture as they might wish about what the relative risks and benefits, pros and cons are of each therapy that they're advocating for. So I think that, I do worry for patient advocacy groups that are heavily funded by pharma about, I think this is some of the problem this has created the problem we've fallen into, which is that the typical mantra from many patient advocacy groups is more drugs faster. And, what I think patients really want is more good drugs faster. And so I think there's some really complicated ethical issues there.
Yeah, I agree. More good drugs. That is agreed. One of the things I want to make sure I go back to, you mentioned about sometimes these slides that are made by the company and during dinners, which we call those the on-label talks or speakers. I mean, these are very heavily regulated. They actually have to be reviewed by the FDA, and the speakers cannot actually deviate from the slides. And the slides usually, supposedly, there should be actually providing balance between benefit as well as the risk for whatever you're actually showing. So the speakers programs, or the actual on-label drug talks, as we call them, they're very heavily regulated because you're not really allowed to even talk about anything beyond the labeled indication. And the slides had to be approved by compliance as well as by the FDA for FDA labeled indication talks. Can you see why? I mean, these could be purely just, I'm just telling you, this drug is approved by the FDA for this indication at this dose. This is how you use it. This is how you do the side effects, how you manage it, blah, blah, blah. Is that pretty straightforward? You still have concerns about that?
Well, I mean, I think there's a balance there. There is an educational service that's being provided, but again, I just come back to the fact that these investments influence behavior and lead to increased revenues, and so there's a tension there. And I don't know what the optimal solution is. And I haven't given these scripted talks before. I can imagine it'd be quite uncomfortable, and I don't know how easy it is to go back and forth and make changes. But I guess that's why I have to come on your podcast to talk about the $80 hamburger, because I can say whatever I want here, Chatty.
Hey, I say whatever I want also.
Yeah.
I mean, I've been, I've been always critical. I mean, I think that you always should be allowed to provide criticism and provide constructive feedback. I think, honestly, I actually think that the pharmaceutical companies are way more open to criticism than the hardcore academic culture. I mean, try to provide constructive criticism to somebody who's running the department or running the division, and see what happens.
Yeah.
Versus, try to provide that and say, about to pharma, and I think they will listen. Let me ask you a quick question. This may be a couple of more questions, but one of them is, there's a lot about pharma having trials with what folks call suboptimal control arms. And some of these control arms that we view suboptimal in America and Canada may be very optimal in sub-Saharan Africa. And you've been interested in global health. You've done amazing work globally outside of Canada. And look, I mean, I was born in Syria, and I can tell you many of these suboptimal control arms people would die in Syria to get access to. So the criticism is that these trials, after they get approved, the patients in these countries don't have access to the drug after it gets approved. The counter argument is, but they at least get access to these drugs if they get enrolled on clinical trials. So you're benefiting maybe 1, 2, 3, 10 patients, and that's better than 0. As somebody who's done global health, how do you view this? Is there a line there in the sand that are we drawing? I mean, What are your thoughts?
Yeah, Chadi, this is a great question. This is something actually we're working on right now. We have a few studies up and running in this space we call research parachutism. Again, this is being led by my current fellow, Dr. Fidel Rubagamia, who's an oncologist from Rwanda. And I actually just listened to your recent interview with our colleagues from Brazil and India about this very issue. So that was, a great discussion. I can completely relate. Like, most of my perspectives come from the Indian health system, where I've had the privilege to to live on sabbatical years ago and retain very close friendships and relationships and travel regularly back and forth. And I can imagine a scenario where there's really no good treatment available in health systems around the world, and getting access to a control arm that may be substandard in a high income country would be advantageous for that patient. But the concept of research parasitism or parachutism is that from a system point of view, these trials do not benefit the lower middle income country health system, because they're taking away potential health system resources, and they are identifying drugs that will never be available for future patients in those systems. And they're also potentially harming patients in high income countries, because the magnitude of therapeutic benefit is probably being overstated, or we don't even know what it is, because it was compared to a control that is not relevant in Canada, the US, Sweden, or the UK. So I think there is, and I think some of our colleagues have done a very good job of identifying this as a problem. And I think at least starting the conversation. Again, there's nuance here. There's no straight answer. But I think recognizing that there is, when you have these massive sums of money at play, there are potential very, very delicate ethical issues that have to be considered on both sides. So again, I guess, like many of the things we've talked about today, Chai, this is not black and white, but certainly it's an issue that requires attention.
Yeah, I agree with you. There are a lot of nuances there. I tend to believe, and I rarely find, actually on the podcast, I rarely offer my own personal opinions, because I feel I'm just a moderator. But as somebody who has actually had patients that try to provide consulting services in very low middle income countries, the drugs are just not available. And any way you can get hold of any of these drugs, I think it's a win, for even if it's one patient or two patients. And it's pretty, you would think, for example, even the easy drugs that we think are very, you never think of Rituxan, you never think of Herceptin, you never think of Avastin here. And it could be a rare commodity for some countries. As you know, I mean, you've done a lot of work. And I'm very conflicted about this. I can see how it can help even few patients, and I'm okay to tolerate that. And I feel that the solution should be on the FDA level, on the regulatory level. I think that, I mean, let's get the low middle income countries help and benefit, and maybe reform how we really provide approval for the drug. So maybe there's a win-win scenario or something.
There might be, I guess, let's just push back a little bit. So why are these trials being done? They are being done almost exclusively to get FDA approval and registration. So the funder, or the pharmaceutical company, that's their primary mandate with this trial. And do they happen to provide a control arm or care to 5, 10, 20% of patients in a lower income health system that they wouldn't get otherwise, perhaps? And that might be good for those patients. And again, I think maybe these conversations are best had with colleagues, as you did in the last episode, who live and work in these systems, who have much greater insight than I do. But I guess there's an imbalance, because then the upside for that company is massive, right? These are billion-dollar upsides that are based on the fact that we don't even know if the American patients are benefiting. And then because the prices are set so high, there's almost an abdication of ethical responsibility to the health systems that help generate that data in the first place. And so to me, there seems to be a fundamental problem. And so are there a few patients that got some treatment they wouldn't otherwise get? Yes, but the upsides are still so strongly in favor on the other side that, and then there's, all these problems with, protecting patents and evergreening and making the prices so high that they will never be available for patients, that I think that, that's why it's called parasitism, right? It's not a bi-directional or a valid, equally valued relationship.
Great points. I can't believe it's been an hour. I can talk to you for hours, man. I'm serious. I love talking to you. But I'm not going to let you off the hook without talking social media. This is the fun part of the podcast. So first of all, I'm not going to push you into Twitter because I've actually lost a lot of my interest in it myself. It was very bad for my mental health. Let me tell you, so many arguments. But I still think it benefits a lot. I mean, there's a way to collaborate with folks, to interact with people. In fact, I've written a paper with Bishal Gawali before I ever met him. So tell me what your thoughts about social media, because you have such a great voice. Honestly, I genuinely say that. And I think a lot of people would benefit from your opinions and ideas if you were on there.
Shadi, well, thank you for those kind words. It's something I've thought a lot about. And as you say, I'm not on Twitter. I don't use it. I don't use social media. And fundamentally, I'm worried about the negative impacts it'll have on my life. I already worry that I spend enough time looking at a screen or a phone. I'm worried that when I go home and I've got 4 kids and trying to be present and focus on things there, I do worry about being drawn into this because I know I'll get heavily engaged and I'll want to debate and things. On the other side, I'm at a point in my career now where I'm not really interested in just publishing papers for the sake of building my CV in my career. I've done that more times than I ever want to. I'm also not interested in publishing papers that like only Bishal and my mother read, right? Like I want to get ideas out there. And I've seen that, Bishal, who's one of a very close friend and colleague, has been so effective, and many others in our field, at distributing and disseminating new ideas, pushing the limits by using Twitter to do that. So I actually conflicted. And I do wonder if my mission is to promote, cancer care that's high quality and equitable to patients all over the world. Maybe this is a step I need to take to try to get some of these ideas out there and to try to contribute. So who knows? Maybe one day you'll see me on Twitter. I mean, I don't have an account, so the way I keep an eye on a few of my friends to see what kind of trouble they're causing. I sit down at Google and just type in Bishal Gawali Twitter.
Even Bishal is not as much on Twitter now. There's a lot of changes happen, honestly.
Yeah.
Politics, and physicians are involved in politics, and I feel Twitter is a good for a few things, but it's taken a turn to the worse, in my opinion, compared to before. But think about it. I can always manage your account. I mean, we can always
there we go.
And you'll be in trouble if I'm the one managing it.
Yeah.
Chris, any final thoughts? Anything I should have asked you? Sometimes I go on tangents and I may have forgotten something really important you wanted to talk about, and I completely overlooked it.
Chadi, no, I think we've covered a really wide range of topics. This has been a lot of fun. I guess maybe just to end on a little bit of a note of optimism, and that is that I'm encouraged with the next generation, and some of it I think has actually been fueled by social media. People are willing to speak out about these issues, and I do think that the next generation of oncologists, I hope, will be more mindful of some of the challenges that we've talked about, some of the problems in our field. And I guess just to I hope that through conversations like this, people realize there are alternative career paths in oncology, and being an advocate for patients and for health systems is one of those roles. And I think that our junior colleagues will hopefully use their creative energy and talents in ways that we've never been able to imagine to address some of the problems that our generation has created and perhaps sustained, and the next generation will hopefully be able to overcome. So I have reason to be hopeful, but I think having these conversations is a great way to at least raise the issues and start thinking about solutions.
Well, Chris, thank you so much. I can assure you there is no hamburger in the United States of America of that price. You overpaid. They overpaid. The most expensive one I paid was $21, and I paid from my own pocket.
All right, there we go. And when I finally get the Healthcare Unfiltered T-shirt, I'll meet up with you at ASCO and we'll go out for a burger. But anyhow, thanks again,
I love that. Thank you so much, Chris.